Thank you so much to Slow Factory and Celine and Truman and Yasmin and everyone for having us. We're super excited to be here. We've been working on this class actually for a couple months now, so we're really excited to delve in with everybody. I think before we start, we want to share a couple things that fashion and blackness is a vast topic. It's huge, and what we're going to be doing today is just sort of skimming the basics. We're not going to be able to cover the breadth of everyone and all the things that have played a role in Black culture in fashion across the world. We're going to start off by focusing on a celebration of Black culture. And we're also going to talk about how fashion has come out of a source of necessity in some places around patchwork and quilting and so forth. And we're also going to touch on some common missteps that brands tend to fall into when they try to engage around race. And then we're going to end things by talking about some actionable ways that brands can do better. So we hope you can stay around for the whole thing, and I hope you learn something from today. And I'll pass it over to Jonathan.
Great. Thank you, Tabitha. So what I'm going to do is just do an overview of the entire presentation, just to give you a roadmap or framework of what we're going through. Truman, can you go to the next slide? Okay, first we're going to define what Blackness is, and just give some overall sort of contextual information about fashion and Blackness. Then we want to go into Black creative impact, so some defining characteristics of the relationship between fashion and Blackness. Then we'd like to go through some of the missteps within the fashion industry, how industry leaders have sort of made mistakes, common mistakes that are made in the fashion industry. And we finally want this to be a solution-based presentation. So you want to give some solutions and give some ideas for what brands can do to do better. So Truman, can you go to the next slide, please? We wanted to start off just talking about Blackness in general. We want to define our terms. Start off by saying that our definition of Black is someone who identifies or would be identified as being full or partial African descent. This is a term that we're not using unproblematically. We understand that race is a social construction. It's not a biological reality. There's no consensus among scholars about when exactly sort of phenotypical difference became racialized, but we can agree that it's often been used nefariously to set up hierarchies. And so, though we're using Blackness to talk about a celebration of an identity rooted in a shared African past and resiliency in the face of slavery and its enduring legacies, we also want to be careful not to reify sort of rigid classifications that are rooted in racial science. Truman, can you go to the next slide, please? And so we just want to talk just generally about Blackness in fashion. We have two quotes here by two important Black fashion scholars that we'll invite you to just read or by yourselves. But a lot of my work is focused on the relationship between the dress of enslaved people and the fashion system. And people don't realize or often, think about Black fashion sort of being rooted in 20th and 21st centuries, but it actually has a longer history that we can go all the way back to, pre-colonial Africa into the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. I don't have the link. I have an article that I wrote on inserting enslaved people into fashion history. I'll find that later and put it in the chat. But a lot of my work is sort of like dealt with these issues. And I have a digital humanities project called Fashioning the Self in Slavery and Freedom, and I explore the dress of enslaved people. So feel free to check out that project. Truman, can you go to the next slide? Actually, yes, okay. Yeah, so we wanted to talk a little bit about fashion out of necessity. So Black folks have long been taking fashion items that weren't intended for us or ingeniously made them their own. And so a lot of Black sartorial genus is sort of rooted in necessity. And so there are two images on the slide. There's, a Black man on the subway in a pair of Timbs. Timbs are, sort of rooted in like hiking culture or, sort of REI, sort of, outdoorsy branding. But, Black and brown communities in urban places have taken Timbs and sort of made them their own, sort of used them creatively. So that's an example of fashion out of necessity. And like a shoe that was sort of rooted in like white hiking cultures sort of been made useful for an urban jungle, as you will. Also, I have a quote here from the WPA narratives, which were oral testimonies taken from formerly enslaved people in the 1930s during the Great Depression. And I highlighted a quote from an enslaved woman who mentions that, patching and darning was stylish when she was a child. So again, there's been a lot of conversations about mending and recycling and upcycling. And this slide just shows you that, Black folks have been on the forefront about conversations about sustainability, and sort of this fashion is like rooted out of like a sense of necessity that's rooted in the 18th and 19th centuries. Truman, can you go to the next slide? Let's see.
So we're going to jump to present day. This graphic is from June 2020, and it shows a snapshot of Black Americans in different aspects of the fashion industry. You'll see shopping, apparel, barbershops, and so forth. And if you can take a look at the numbers are pretty low. And research has shown that the vast majority of Black workers in the fashion industry are actually sales staff, and they're not at the executive level. The biggest takeaway from that is that there's not adequate representation of Black people in the industry. And we know that's not because Black people don't love fashion and don't want to be a part of the industry. It's because of many other factors that we're going to examine later on in the presentation. Next slide, please, Truman.
Yeah, so Tabitha and I wanted to include some important figures from Black fashion history. This slide by no means is exhaustive. We could spend like hours going through important figures in Black fashion history, but we decided to focus on Elizabeth Keckley, Ann Lowe, Patrick Kelly, and Willie Smith. Elizabeth Keckley was born an enslaved woman in Virginia, and she bought her freedom and the freedom of her son, and quickly became an important dressmaker to the Washingtonian elite. And she became Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker. She actually wrote a memoir called Behind the Scenes about her time in the White House and about her time being Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker. So she's an important understudied Black fashion figure from the 19th century. Another important figure is Ann Lowe. Ann Lowe's grandmother was actually born enslaved. So through Ann Lowe, you can sort of track sort of Black fashion skills from the 19th century, from the era of enslavement, all the way up to the mid 20th century. Ann Lowe was born in Alabama, moved to New York City and lived in Harlem for most of her life. She had boutiques in Midtown Manhattan, and she's best known for designing Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis's wedding dress. So that's Ann Lowe. Patrick Kelly is also a Black Southerner. He was born in Mississippi, lived in New York briefly, but he really made his name in Paris. And he had his own couture house in Paris called Patrick Kelly, his namesake. And Patrick Kelly was the first Black recognized couturier. Of course, there were plenty of other couturiers prior to Patrick Kelly, but he was the first who was recognized by the Chambre Syndicale. So Patrick Kelly is an important, he unfortunately passed away quite young from complications from AIDS, HIV. And the same is true from Willie Smith. He passed away quite young from complications from AIDS, HIV, but he was an important Black fashion designer. He went to FIT. Right after graduating, he sort of cut his teeth in the garment district and worked for a sportswear brand called Digits. He opened his own clothing company called Willie Smith Limited, or Willie Wear. Willie Wear was a really important fashion brand that you saw people wearing throughout the late 70s, 80s, up into the early 90s. So this is just we're only scratching the surface with this slide. There are plenty of other figures that we could have included, but this just shows you that there's so many important Black fashion figures that haven't gotten attention. I mean, I've been watching the new Halston series on Netflix, and one Black fashion figure that I wasn't aware of was Halston had a lover who became part of the company named Ed Austin, who was a fashion designer in his own right. So there's so many important Black fashion designers that haven't been recognized. All right, can we go to the next slide?
One thing I want to add there, Jonathan, you and I, when we were planning this class, we were talking about the fact that just talking about Black figures in fashion history is like a semester's worth of conversations by itself. There are so many others like Stephen Burrows, Dapper Dan, and so forth. So this is just, and who the people that are not included on this list is not an indication of their impact. We just wanted to share some names with you all. Next, we're going to talk about Black creative impact. Black influence has been at the forefront of fashion. We're going to delve into the fact that while Black influence has been at the forefront of fashion, it's done while also erasing our identities and our impact in a very significant way. And we're going to delve into that later on as well.
Yeah, so in this section of our class, we want to focus on aspects of Black culture that have been celebrated in fashion without adequate attribution in many cases. Certain trends taken from Black culture, whether it's hair related to the body, jewelry, nails, makeup, have not been properly attributed. So here are some ways that Black creativity has manifested itself in the industry. So first is through creative ingenuity. We're going to talk about sort of the creative spirit within Black communities that have been appropriated within the fashion industry. Going back to an earlier slide when I was talking about patching and darning in Timberlands, we want to talk a little bit about resourcefulness, the ways in which Black people have made fashion and sartorial innovation out of necessity. We also want to talk about the power of the Black dollar, what until very recently was referred to as the Negro market, how Black individuals often support Black designers and Black creative genius. We also want to talk about Blackness in pop culture and how Blackness has been appropriated within larger mainstream American society, whether it's fashion trends, hair trends, makeup trends, jewelry trends, how things that are particular to Black communities end up being appropriated by a larger white mainstream culture. All right, Truman, can you go to the next slide? So an example of this is Paris is Burning, if anyone's seen that important documentary from the late 80s that focuses on ball culture in New York City. And even though it's not a fashion documentary, fashion plays a big part of the story. So many important terminologies like throwing shade or reading or saying the library is open actually has roots in ball culture. And one thing that I'm really struck about with ball culture is that, before I really sort of started delving into like queer histories of fashion, I would have assumed that ball culture had its origins in the 1970s, 1960s, 1950s, but there have been a number of important recent studies that show that ball culture has roots in the 19th century. amongst enslaved people. So this is there's almost a 200-year history of ball culture in urban centers in the United States. It's just an example of, queer, marginalized people making a way out of no way, and carving out a space for themselves. And Paris is Burning is an important documentary that highlights that. Another example of sorry, Truman, can you go back to the previous slide? Yeah. Another example that is artist Peter Brathwaite, who I'm a big fan of. His Instagram is Peter Brathwaite. He's a Black British opera singer. And during the quarantine, he started sort of staging tableaus within his apartment in which he recreated classic works from the Western artistic canon. And again, he didn't buy anything. I mean, this is like during the height of the quarantine where people were really sort of locked down within their homes, and he would use items within his apartment and sort of recreate famous works. And it was always very personal because it's its own personal item. So the quilt that's around his waist is actually a family quilt that he often incorporates in his stage tableaus. And he actually has a book coming out that's being published by the Getty. So these are just two examples of like creative ingenuity. I mean, again, as Tabitha has already said, I teach a number of classes on Black fashion, and we spent an entire semester exploring these dynamics. So there could be a class simply on creative ingenuity within Black communities, but we just want to give you two examples of that. All right. Truman, can you go to the next slide?
Thank you, Truman. So here we have the first graphic is a Dapper Dan design. And then the next one is Gucci's appropriation of it in 2017. Many of y'all have seen this because of things like social media, with the type of awareness that's needed around the stealing of Black culture has been sort of thrust into the forefront of fashion conversations. So we see that Gucci copied this design in 2017. They got called out for it, and Gucci stated that their copy was an exploration of popular culture and that the look was homage rather than reappropriation. And then Gucci then went on to actually partner with Dapper Dan, and you'll see that in the third image. They did a collaboration. And it's also an important critique to consider that Black culture tends to gain a kind of mainstream attention in relation to its proximity to whiteness, whether it's in terms of a partnership or a white celebrity wearing Black trends. We see often Black trends and Black fashion designers and Black creatives and so forth, they don't get the recognition that they deserve until there's a certain sort of association with whiteness, which is problematic in and of itself. Can you go to the next slide, please, Truman?
And the thing that gets me about Gucci's partnership with Dapper Dan is that, and this is, I feel like there was no like creativity in it. They sort of, going back to the previous slide, like if you go to that third image, Truman, sorry to make you backtrack. Can you go to that back to the previous slide? That third image is after Gucci had partnered with Dapper Dan, and they're basically recreating the same aesthetic from the photo on the far left. They didn't take, all of Dapper Dan's creative genius and go somewhere else with it. They just recreated what had already been done. And that for me was just like, made it more problematic. So, sorry,
and it's always a question that I think we need to ask is, would these companies be doing these sort of initiatives if they weren't called out publicly, if there wasn't a public sort of accountability around the theft of Black designs?
Absolutely. Yeah, Truman, can you go to the next slide? So, I mean, a running theme in our class is that Black people have innovated sustainability, and ideas of sustainability have been gentrified in recent times. But I just think about, like, my great grandmother, who was a child of the Depression, and how frugal she was, and how she didn't throw anything away, and how she repaired her clothing as opposed to throwing it away. Um, Black people innovated sustainability because we had to, because of economic marginalization and undercapitalization. Yet, instead of getting credit for things that we innovated out of, because we had to, out of necessity, the conversation about sustainability is sort of seen as being new and novel, but people have been doing this for centuries. All right, can you go to the next slide? Another important question that we just want to throw out there and have you, as our students, as our pupils, think about is what happens when consumers value and recognize the power of Black ingenuity. And so just let that question sort of, sit in your heads and think about what power lies in that question. All right. So the power of the Black dollar. So there's been a long-standing commitment within Black communities of supporting Black-owned brands like Sean John, Fubu, or Telfar, to name a few. And this has led to a widespread success of these brands as a relationship between the brand and consumers reflective of their identity in politics. So there was a really important moment, I'd say in the late 90s, early 2000s, in which there were like a spate of Black-owned sportswear brands like Fubu or Fat Farm, Sean John, sort of brands like that. And these were Black-owned brands, and they were supported by Black and Brown communities. And we sort of want to get back to that moment when there was these sort of Black-owned brands that were making clothes for Black people, and we sort of gotten away from that moment. However, we are seeing sort of a resurgence of that ethos again, thinking about someone like Telfar Clemens or other sort of up and coming, Black designers like Pierre Moss or Christopher John Rogers. Let's see, Truman, can you go to the next slide? And these are two very young Black designers who Tabitha and I think, need to get more attention. On the right is Brandon Blackwood. He has a handbag brand. And I really love this photo of him because he's wearing a sweatshirt that features, a number of Black-owned brands. Let's see, Pierre Moss, Telfar Clemens, Brandon Blackwood, which is his brand, Off-White, Virgil Abloh, Yeezy, Fenty, Laquan Smith. So he's, not only is he a Black person with a Black-owned brand, he's also shouting out other important Black-owned brands. Another brand that's been getting a lot of attention as of late is Kyrie. Again, young Black jewelry designer, and he recently won the Vogue Fashion Fund. So he's got an influx of capital. But he's thinking through how does Blackness and luxury interact with each other, and what space is there for a Black-owned luxury brand that makes jewelry for Black people. So these are just two examples of Black-owned brands and the creator is thinking specifically for Black consumers, and the brand is supported. Both brands are supported in large part by Black consumers. So that's an important dynamic that we want to highlight in this class.
Truman, can you go back to the previous slide? I just have one more thing to add. I think there's something to be said for Black people seeing ourselves reflected in luxury goods and what the impact of that is in terms of what we're actually able to purchase. As we look at some of the numbers, Black people wield $1.3 million in annual spending power, and that's up 114% from the year 2000, and it's actually estimated to hit 1.8 trillion by 2024, according to Nielsen. And we actually only make up 13.8% of the population. So that's just some of the numbers for us to examine.
Can
Can
I?
you go to the next slide? Sorry, did you have something to add, Jonathan?
Sorry to cut you off.
It's okay.
But I guess one thing another question that I want to highlight is thinking about Black liberation and its relationship to capitalism. And I'm very critical of capitalism to the point of almost being a Marxist. And so I'm very critical of the idea that they're like, Black people have to assert their self-worth through their consumptive power. But at the same time, we're all embedded in this capitalist system. And if we're going to be embedded in this capitalist system, then we should all be able to benefit from it equally. So, I mean, I'm just throwing out questions, but it's something to think about. Like, what does it mean for, being a person of African descent, being a Black person, and being embedded in capitalism and carving out a space for yourself and sort of working towards Black liberation, but also being sort of a cog within this capitalist system. I mean, I think someone like, Brandon Blackwood or Kyrie or Telfar Clemens or Pierre Moss are also thinking about those questions. And all Black people are sort of thinking about those questions as well. So.
You can go to the next slide, Truman. Okay, thank you. So now we take a look at Blackness in pop culture. We know over time, Black fashion has played a prominent role in the self-expression of iconic Black figures. And oftentimes, these looks are sidelined and only made mainstream when white artists appropriate the designs without proper credit and without living the experience of being Black. We can see in these images here that it's clear that Billie Eilish's look is inspired by female hip-hop artists of past decades. The note here, again, is centered on the fact that white artists can put on pieces of Black culture without truly knowing or having to deal with the full experience and nuances of being Black, and many times they are hesitant to speak up around things like police violence. They can conveniently take it off, as we're seeing is happening right now with Billie Eilish, and as we've seen with Miley Cyrus. She went through a phase where she was trying to shed her Disney image, and she dabbled in hip hop culture, and she became much more famous because of it. And now she sort of reverted back to a very different look. So these are all things that we need to deeply examine. Next slide, please, Truman. Thank you. And again, we see the same thing here. Women like Little Kim, Foxy Brown, were constantly being dragged in the press and by the public for wearing things that we see are now trendy. In the first image, we see Sarah Jessica Parker with the nameplate necklace. That's a core part of a certain style aesthetic for Black girls. And then we also see Little Kim with the pink colored hair. And we see also the Kardashians, who are known for appropriating and stealing Black culture. We also know that they have done the same thing with braids. When they started wearing braids, the magazines were saying it's a new trend, it's so trendy, when Black women have been wearing braids for a very, very long time. And we even saw Kim, when she was asked about the braids, refer to it as Bo Derek braids, as if as if the style actually originated in white culture. Next slide, please, Truman.
Sorry, Tabitha, I would just want to riff off something that you already said, because I think it's really important. But, Black people have, been dressing like this for, decades, and we suffer for it. Like, we suffer for wearing braids. We suffer for wearing our hair naturally. We suffer for, wearing colorful weaves. We suffer for, wearing a lot of gold jewelry. But when it's sort of pared down and gentrified, then it's sort of seen as avant-garde or edgy or fashionable. And that's the biggest problem, that, that it's appropriated for, like, things that are appropriated, things that, we were sort of castigated for. So I just thought that was really important. So now we want to transition a little bit, and we want to talk about some of the missteps that have happened within the fashion industry. And we have it separated into a few themes. The first is Blackface. And then we want to talk about anthropomorphism, which is associating or morphing Black people into animals. Another problem that we've noted is sort of reinforcing stereotypes about Black people that often happens within the fashion industry. Another thing that we've noted is a degree of tokenism. We also want to talk about the current catchphrase, cultural appropriation. Also an important issue is the commodification of activism or radical aesthetics. And lastly, we want to touch on some problematic references to slavery.
So we'll start off by talking about Blackface. In this first image here, which was from an FIT alumni fashion show, we see the bushy eyebrows, the big lips, and the oversized features. When this, again, I think that we are in a time where social media has really democratized responses to these sort of to these really awful instances of racism, and FIT responded, and the actual designer responded that he himself he was an Asian American designer, and he himself had been victim to racism, so he did not see how these particular designs were actually racist. But we know that there's a need for always checking in, if you don't have the historical context around certain things, checking in with other people to make sure that what you're doing is actually offensive. And then also thinking about, as you're designing for the people, for the students that are on the call, if you're a designer, deeply examining where your inspiration is coming from is really critical, and really doing research around where's your inspiration coming from to make sure that it doesn't actually have roots in racism. And then we see the second image is the infamous Gucci blackface sweater, which resulted in them pulling it from stores. And again, they also had another excuse around it being inspired by an artist, and they didn't mean for it to be racist, etc. And because of the backlash, they had to pull it from stores. And we'll be talking about later on how brands can actually, in actionable ways, think about how to design in ways where these things would not happen in the first place.
And the thing that struck me about the FIT fashion show is that there actually was a Black model in that show who was styled like the image on the left. And she was very vocal, like, I'm not wearing it, that's racist. And no one listened to her. So and students actually like corroborated like what she was saying, but no one listened. Because so there are people speaking out, but they move forward with the fashion show despite people saying that it was racist. So I think to add on to what Tabitha said, like, it's important to listen.
I also go ahead, Jonathan.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
And this is in reference to the Gucci sweater, but it's kind of astounding that the sweater made it through the design process, was on the runway, and this is a photo from the website. So throughout that entire process, I'm sure someone must have said like, oh, this is questionable, like, I'm not sure how I feel about this, but again, no one listened. So it just, again, I think sometimes like reading a room is really important.
And I think too about how traumatic it must have been for that Black model to have to speak up in a professional setting and to say like, this is actually not okay. And I think about the trauma that oftentimes Black people have to go through when they are in where they're in the minority in places where racism is really obvious. So that's something to think about as well. Jonathan, can you go, not Jonathan, Truman, can you go to the next slide, please?
So we also want to talk about anthropomorphism, which is something that we've noted over and over again. So on the middle image, you see a Vogue cover with LeBron James and Gisele Bündchen, shot by Annie Leibovitz. And as you can see, it looks very similar to Tarzan, or is that Tarzan? What's the name? Tarzan, King Kong, sorry. King Kong movie poster. All the way down to like the satiny green dress that was from the shoot. So again, there's, you know, one thing that you see is like Black folks are often associated with primates. And this is a clear example of that. But it happens with other animals as well. This is image on the right is Naomi Campbell. It's by a French photographer named Jean-Paul Goude. You might recognize his work from his work with Grace Jones. He's the same photographer that did the infamous Paper magazine cover with Kim Kardashian, breaking the internet. So he loves working with Black models and sort of like distorting bodies. And you kind of see that in this photograph. Naomi Campbell, who's amazing, is made to be sort of put on equal pairing with the cheetah. And of course, this wasn't meant to be a negative, like it's meant to be positive. Like she's super fast, like she's superhuman, she's like a superhero. But at the same time, it does reinforce a stereotype about Black women sort of being the strong Black woman. Like instead of, Black women being associated with like vulnerability or sensitivity or grace or beauty, they're often associated with like superhuman strength or sort of being able to like withstand the struggle. So it's really subtle, but again, you see this over and over again in which Black people are often made to be associated with animals in some way. All right.
So this slide starts off by showing the model Abby Lee in a really problematic Vogue Italia spread. We see her with the thin eyebrows, the large gold jewelry, and the teardrops under the eye. It's disputed, but it's widely believed that the meaning behind a teardrop tattoo, for those who don't know, was that a person had killed another person, lost a loved one, or had been raped in prison. And then the second one is a look from Thom Browne, styled on a Black model despite the watermelon motif. And for those who don't know, that trope came into full force right after slavery. Free Black people grew, ate, and sold watermelons. And in doing so, they sort of made the fruit a symbol of their freedom. And Southern whites, who were threatened by Blacks' newfound freedom, they responded by making the fruit a symbol of Black people's perceived uncleanliness, laziness, childishness, and unwanted public presence. And the third one is a look from Schiaparelli's latest collection, in which a Black model is styled in a muscle dress, which reifies the strong Black woman trope that we just spoke about. And I think that just to take it outside of fashion a little bit, it stems all the way back to young Black children in schools who are punished at greater rates than young white children because they're considered to be able to handle certain things in a different way. You can link it back to Black women who are giving birth. They often have to struggle to get pain medication because doctors assume that Black women can handle pain more than white women. Truman, can
And
you go to
also,
the next? Sorry, go ahead, Jonathan.
and just going back to that previous slide, I think the Thom Browne example and the Schiaparelli example are accidental. It really is a misstep, but there is something nefarious about the Vogue Italia image, like, you know, the tracks of weave, the painting on eyebrows, the acrylic nails, the copious gold jewelry. Like, she's made to be ghetto, or ghetto, air quotes, using air quotes. And, you know, it's a gag. And the gag is that she's white, but she's dressed like, you know, someone who's ghetto. And so, you know, it happens accidentally in the case of, you know, Schiaparelli or Tom Brown. I just think the stylist or the casting person didn't sort of make the connection that we're making in class right now. But in the case of the Vogue Italia, I think it was just them ridiculing Black styling. So we also want to talk about tokenism, which is something that you see over and over within the fashion industry. And we chose two examples. Back to Naomi Campbell. As you can see, this is her alongside, you know, other supermodels. And most recently, the model Precious Lee. This is an image from a Versace runway, when she was one of a handful of models of color, but also one of a handful of fat models. And so you see, you know, designers patting themselves on the back because, you know, Naomi Campbell opens or closes a show, or designers patting themselves on the back because they include someone like Precious Lee or Ashley Graham or Paloma El Cesar, because they sort of represent body diversity. But 95% of the other models are thin, white, or very light skinned. And so, you know, it's not true diversity. It's a like a lip service to diversity. And you not only see it in terms of models, but you see it in terms of, like, you know, a company might hire a Black CEO, or they might hire a diversity czar, but it doesn't really reflect like a structural change in how the company is run. It's just for optics. And so you see a Black president or a Black CEO, or you see, you know, they have Naomi Campbell as the face of the brand, but the structure is still right. And so that's what we want to highlight in this slide, the ways in which diversity hires are like a diverse casting, or a diverse casting, like one or two Black models or one or two fat models, is weaponized against calls for diversity, actually, because what we're calling for is like a true sort of overturning of the way the fashion system is operated. And the way they sort of answer those demands is just by like casting one or two Black models or one or two fat models without actually changing how the company is run. All right. We also, of course, want to talk about the topic du jour, cultural appropriation. And for me, sort of emblematic of this issue of cultural appropriation is the work of Marc Jacobs, who's like a serial cultural appropriator. So on the left is an image from Marc Jacobs' Spring/Summer 2018 collection. Many of the models were styled in head wraps. And when people saw the way in which the models were styled, like, it looked appropriative, like he was sort of stealing Afro-diasporic head wrapping traditions. It's a little more complicated than that. He was actually inspired by a Wall Street Journal shoot of Sofia Coppola, and she had on a silk turban. So the reference was more sort of old Hollywood, sort of dripped in jewels. But the problem is that different garments look different on different bodies. And so, like, seeing this head wrap out of its context, it looked appropriative. So it's still problematic. The image on the right, I don't have to explain why that's problematic. It's white models who, and faux locks were braided into their hair. Of course, that's just stealing, you know, a hairstyle that has been innovated by Black people and putting it on white models. for me, what makes it cultural appropriation, what really makes it cultural appropriation is when you're stealing a sartorial innovation or item that's particular to a marginalized community, and that you're also benefiting from it. When you're making money from it, that's when it really becomes a problem. It's already a problem, but it makes it even more nefarious when you're sort of profiting from this marginalized communities' cultural innovations.
So we're going to talk a little bit about the commodification of activism. We see here on the left a Dior feminist t-shirt on the runway that retails for $710. So not only is this commodifying activism, which is usually really dangerous work for Black people and is a job that for many people either does not pay anything or pays very little money. The t-shirt itself is actually very inaccessible to many women at that price point. For those of you who don't know, I was one of the women who helped plan the Women's March on Washington back in 2017, and we saw a wave of activist T-shirts and a wave of feminism at that time that many of it was very problematic because you have instances like this where people are using the feminism, using these values that people have fought for and continue to fight for to make money or to give an impression of progressivism or activism. And then the image on the right, we see Democrats in the House and Senate wearing kente cloth, and they took a knee for 8 minutes and 48 seconds in honor of George Floyd, capitalizing on the public moment of outrage in the summer of 2020, without actually making any tangible efforts to defund the police and to keep Black communities safe from police violence, or even to make systemic changes to actually protect Black people from racism in all systems in this country. Next slide, please, Truman.
And, just building off of what Tabitha just said in reference to the use of kente cloth within the fashion industry, something that we see over and over again is like the poaching or stealing the aesthetics of Black radicalism. And a really good example of that is this Prada t-shirt, which you see there's a cartoon drawing of Angela Davis, an important Black revolutionary. And you can't really see it on the slide, but it says "right on." Again, sort of like cartoonifying like the important work that Angela Davis has done throughout her life. And if anyone was confused if it was actually Angela Davis or not, we included an archival image of Angela Davis. So if anyone's seen the Black Power mixtape, this is a screenshot from the Black Power mixtape. But again, she's wearing the same Black orange turtleneck, large afro. So it's clearly they're referencing Angela Davis in this t-shirt. And I have to apologize. I have to run. I'm doing another virtual event that starts in 10 minutes. So I just want to thank Tabitha, my lovely co-teacher. Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure organizing this course with you. And I want to thank the Slow Factory for giving us this opportunity to share our work. And yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions. And like Tabitha's gonna teach the rest of the class. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. We'll miss you.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you.
And I think one thing to add about this Angela Davis t-shirt is that Angela Davis continues to be ostracized in certain spaces because of her beliefs, particularly around Palestine. And these brands that are making money off of her image are not having conversations around values that she actually holds dear. Next slide, please, Truman. So problematic references to slavery. We know that oftentimes when there is privilege over a marginalized group, there have been instances of appropriation, theft, and poaching of the aesthetics of the identity, which really strips it of its meaning. So we see here, one second, we see here in the first one, we see the Dolce & Gabbana slave sandal. In the second one, we see the Jeremy Scott shackle sneaker. and then the Mark McNary Manifest Destiny t-shirt. Next slide, please. So we see the capitalizing off of pain. As Black people, we spoke a little bit earlier about, we touched on it briefly, about how Black pain is seen in medical institutions, that Black women often are not given pain medication because they're sort of assumed to be able to handle much more pain, to have these sort of superhuman abilities. And our pain is often minimalized in many different ways. And we see, especially with celebrities, they're seen as capitalistic opportunities. So even in death, Biggie's legacy was seen as something to be capitalized off of. And we see it here in the Versace Medusa Biggie sunglasses. And you see also the sunglasses from a screenshot from Biggie's video where he's wearing the sunglasses. And we know that Versace saw this as an opportunity to continue to capitalize off of Biggie's legacy, which really rose in prominence after his death. Next slide, please, Truman. Okay, so now we're going to get into some common causes of missteps in the industry. So we did use the term microaggression, and just want to offer some critique around that term. For many people, racism is seen as not something that's on a spectrum. All of it is harmful to Black people. And microaggressions is a term that's centered around whiteness. It's centered around a need to sort of frame some racist actions as not as important and not as impactful as others, which is problematic. But we know that the fashion industry has really exhibited an ongoing problem with reckoning with race, and many brands struggle with identifying why they really continue to have problems with race. So here we identify some common missteps. Very few successful brands are run by Black people and other people of color. For many fashion houses, there's still a lack of representation on the runway. Brands often stop at the representation on the runway because it's usually done as a PR solution or a way to respond to the industry pushing on them to have more models of color. And then we also see that many of them tend to have Black models that are racially ambiguous, and they tend to stay clear of the really darker skin models. And if they go with the dark skin models, they go with the really dark skin models in a way that's really othering. Brands don't have Black people in key positions in the company where they actually have the ability to make really important decisions. So what ends up happening is that the brand is making decisions through a predominantly white lens. There's a lack of focus on deeper learning and anti-racist training for non-Black employees, which can lead to harm for Black employees, even as the company attempts to pay lip service publicly. So we know that continues to be a problem. If you're thinking about how to address racism, how to address race in a piecemeal sort of way, and you're thinking of solving them sort of one at a time, and you're not thinking about having racial equity be a core tenet to everything that the company does, to every part of the company, then you're going to end up in instances where there still exists racism in pockets of the company, and where it is seen as lip service, and where Black people are not free from harm in the workplace. And the last one is brands discount the power of the Black dollar and shape their marketing around white consumers. So, we talk about this, much earlier. Jonathan talked a little bit about reframing our identity of Black people, not solely around consumerism, not solely around capitalism. But we do know that brands who tend to shape their marketing solely around white customers are also problematic, because Black people also want to shop for things. Black people also want to partake in things as well. Next slide, Truman. So what can brands do? Many of y'all are probably thinking, we just threw a lot at you around tons of problems, tons of issues. What can brands actually do to try to set your company on a path to more racial equity? Next slide, please, Truman. Okay. look at equity in three areas. The internal, what is the learning that the CEO, the founders, the C-suite are undergoing to ensure that people leading the brand actually understand Blackness and equity and racism? The interpersonal, our work culture is focused on fostering and affirming Black talent. Is the workplace a safe place, a brave space for Black people, for other people of color? And the systemic, how is the brand using its voice and power, marketing dollars, etc., to address and dismantle racism in the industry? Be open to transformative change. A lot of brands are like, yes, we have a problem. We know we have to do something about it. But when there are actual solutions in front of them, they may be like, well, this is the way we've always done things. It's really hard for us to change. So actually be open to transformative change within the company. Do more research. A huge problem in the fashion industry is just the breakneck speed in which things are done, in which things are designed and sold. Fast fashion is a huge part of that. But what ends up happening is that designers don't have the time and space to actually be thoughtful and intentional about the work that's being done and about the products that are being put out into the world. So make time to ask questions, reach out to more knowledgeable people, and pay them for their expertise. But really factor in that time to do more research about the roots of your inspiration, the roots of every part of what you're going to put out into the world. Realize that there are no single issues. Realize that it's all interconnected. When we talk, this class specifically is focused around fashion and Blackness, but we think about things like anti-Asian hate. We think about support for Palestine. We think about gender equity in the workplace, and these things are all interconnected. So if you're only focused on Blackness as one thing within the company, that's going to be an issue as well. Decenter whiteness. So what does that mean? That means actually finding ways to center the voices of the marginalized people within the company. There are many ways that can be done. You can have groups within the company where you're actually listening to the people who come from marginalized communities and actually taking their advice on how things should be done within the brand. So hire Black people in positions of power and actually give them power, space, and resources to create change. If you have a Black person in your life and they don't feel empowered to be honest with you about your missteps, they're actually not really a part of your community. So how can you create an atmosphere that welcomes constructive criticism in the workplace and allows people to really create change? And realize the difference between structural change and public relation band-aids. So we saw last summer so many brands. There was an article that I read that listed 200 brands after the George Floyd murder, and all the ways that they were trying to make change. They were giving big donations, they were doing this, they were doing that, but it was in response to an uprising in this country. And we know that if you're only responding to public relations issues, then you're actually not thinking about how to have structural change within the brand. And it's those moments when there's actually nothing in the news that's going on, even though that's really hard because Black people are under attack in this country every day. But it's actually during those times when you have a chance to sit and think about how can you infuse racial equity into every part of the company. Those are the times that you will be better equipped to deal with things when it bubbles up into the public consciousness. Next slide, please, Truman. Okay, so this class is part one of a series. We're going to have a second class, and you all can see some of the things that we're going to delve into in the second class on this slide. We're going to continue to provide you all with actionable ways to make change. We can talk about the problems all we want, but if brands do not have a way to actually think about solutions, then we're going to be stuck in the awareness phase of our activism. So these are just some things we're going to delve into in the second class that you all can read.